Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Obviously, I normally say at this point, don't let me disturb your lunch, but clearly that's superfluous at the moment. I'm delighted to have this crowd with us for one of our first trade events of the fall, which is both more provocative and more broad in implications than even the title suggests. We're here today for a discussion of should Korea join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a very, I think, innovative new policy brief by Jeffrey Schott, who, of course, is the senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute who leads all our studies on trade negotiations, particularly regional trade negotiations, and Cathleen Cimino, who we just promoted, and we're delighted is sticking with us as a research associate here at the Institute in doing trade studies. We have with us as well two distinguished members of the congressional community. They're so distinguished that I managed to lose their bios somewhere on the way. I will introduce them after the initial remarks. We're going to be a little bit different than usual because, as I said, there's a broader issue here, not just of how Korea, on an economic and political economy basis, decides and should decide to treat the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, but how this feeds back on US policy and, frankly, the broader context of the likelihood of seeing TPP progress, whatever negotiations USTR is conducting at the moment. And that's why we have two senior congressional staff here to talk about that. But as a result, we are, I'm afraid, for the first time in a long time, going to be favoring our live audience over our friends on the web. That part of the discussion will be held off the record to just the people in this room. The initial discussion, though, of should Korea join the Trans-Pacific Partnership is on the record. We'll be posting, of course, right now already the policy brief, and I look forward to Jeff and Kathleen taking us through their economic and strategic vision of how Korea's choices will play out. Jeff, if you'd like to get us started, or Kathleen, if you'd like to get us started, even better. Thank you.
So first I'll just say, well, of course, TPP is broadly recognized as the most substantial trade agreement in the Asia-Pacific in terms of prospective trade liberalization and also the scope of rulemaking. And so in our view, the draw to TPP for its members is fairly straightforward. To promote and complement domestic reforms and boost productivity across the economy and create new opportunities for trade and investment. So the TPP is now playing out in its endgame negotiations among its 12 member countries, and Korea is now considering whether to become the 13th member. They began consultations late last year, and of course, there's broad recognition in Korea that they'll eventually have to join TPP. And the question is, will it be sooner or later? So that's really the key question that we discuss in this paper that we're presenting today. So before we look into options for integrating Korea into TPP, we first assess where TPP lies in Korea's overall trade strategy and also what Korea has to gain from joining. So Korean participation in TP would represent really the culmination of 15 years of FTA negotiations with its major trading partners, and that includes, of course, the United States with the Korea-US FTA, or KORUS, which has really set kind of gold standard for subsequent FTA negotiations, and in many ways including the TPP. TPP would also complement Korean trade initiatives, the Korea-China FTA, the trilateral China-Japan-Korea FTA, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the ASEAN plus 6 countries. And all of these advance economic integration in the Asia-Pacific in important ways. And indeed, a stated goal of Korea has been to be a kind of linchpin between TPP and RCEP. So joining would, of course, be a necessary and valuable part of realizing this goal. So first, I'll set the context with a brief snapshot of Korea's trade relations with its top trading partners, including the United States and Japan, two major economies of TPP, of course, and consequently the drivers of Korea's trade investment with the TPP countries. Now, the striking but of course, well-known trend that you see here is the growing importance of economic ties with China. So the levels of trade with the US and Japan continue to be significant, but the relative importance has declined significantly over the past decade. So just to highlight a few numbers, Korea trade with China has expanded 7-fold over this period, which is larger than US and Japan combined. And we see that the Chinese share of Korean global trade rose from 9% in 2000 to 21% in 2013. And of course, you see the opposite trend for the US and Japan, and slightly less so for the European Union. So I say this as it's not surprising that in terms of Korean negotiating priorities, the top priority is to conclude China and Korea FTA, which launched in May 2012, and if things go according to plan, there are hopes to complete by the end of this year. By contrast, the two parallel initiatives, the CJK talks and RCEP, of course, trade is full of its acronyms. These are, of course, important, but they're also in many ways less ambitious and on a longer time horizon than TPP. So in our view, the timeline and substance of TPP should make it a priority for Korea. We see that the TPP 12 countries currently cover about 1/3 of Korean trade and outward foreign direct investment, and of course includes the second and third largest investors in Korea after the European Union. So a lot of figures here, but just to put those numbers on the screen to show more detail. Again, you see the collective share of Korean global trade and investment highlighted here, roughly 1/3 across categories. This is with the exception of FDI from TPP into Korea, a little more than 50%. But of course, this is driven again by the United States and Japan, which is not surprising as the second and third largest investors in Korea. You'll see this pattern across categories, really highlighting the importance of the US and Japan. Now, the relatively low numbers in FDI also highlight the importance of and opportunity within services and investment for Korea. So given these trade and investment linkages, it's not surprising that Korea has already established formal ties with each country in TPP, either through conclusion of an FTA or current engagement in the talks. So, but to emphasize, importantly, TPP would offer an opportunity to revitalize bilateral trade talks with Japan, perhaps in a more conducive regional context. Korean talks with Japan stalled in late 2004, have resumed preparatory consultations, and now Korea is engaged with Japan in the trilateral China-Japan-Korea talks. But a fundamental point is that TPP is much more valuable to Korea precisely because Japan is part of the deal. So one might conclude, well, given Korea's pre-existing ties and trade pacts with the TPP countries, what would be the benefit of joining? Well, first, TPP would expand the scope and economic value of existing trade deals. Given TPP's more rigorous standards and coverage of new issues, of course, these are the often thrown around, the state-owned enterprises, competition policy, environment and labor, all of which builds on existing WTO commitments and also FTA obligations. So we really expect to see a kind of upgrading of pacts, especially with ASEAN member countries. Now, in terms of the economic gains, based on the work of Peter Petri and his colleagues, we see in the case of Korea, TPP is anticipated to generate income and export gains of about 2% and 12% respectively, whereas staying out of TPP would incur modest costs. Beyond economics, Korean participation also elevates the strategic weight of the deal for the United States and, of course, as a key player in Northeast Asia. And importantly, it also reinforces Asia-Pacific economic integration, really which has been based on the Chorus FTA model. So as a key architect, implicitly in many ways, as a key architect of TPP, Korea's participation is a logical step. Now, given that there would be conceivably limited entry costs, above the reforms that Korea is already pursuing in implementing its FTAs with the United States, with the European Union. But that said, that's not to oversimplify. There will be challenges like any negotiation. Ascension to TPP would require revisiting sensitive issues, agricultural issues, investor-state dispute settlement. And there are also some chorus plus issues, state-owned enterprises, small and medium enterprises, supply chains, etc. Foremost, TPP would also require a bilateral deal with Japan. And we do emphasize this will not be easy given a history of stalled negotiations and, of course, political and diplomatic frictions over several important non-economic issues, to put that way. So it's also important that we not gloss over these political realities as well. So just briefly here, I'll show and highlight some of the numbers I referenced from Petri et al. Basically, you'll see the modest losses incurred with for not participating would translate to significant gains for Korea with participation in TPP. Much of these gains, again, are due to closer integration with Japan, but also increased trade with countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico. I will point out there's also, as you'll see, large gains estimated from RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, but this is mostly assuming ambitious outcomes. You will see also that the largest gains are from a TPP, which involves China. Now, this is a long-term outlook for TPP, given China's expressed interest. And that said, presumably much of this would accrue from conclusion of a Korea-China FTA. But again, this assumes ambitious outcome of the talks. So moving along, in our view, the incentives for joining TPP are fairly clear, and this leads us to where the talks stand and could Korea feasibly join. Now, all eyes have been on the market access talks with Japan, namely dealing with Japan's demands to insulate a small but significant group of sensitive farm imports from tariff liberalization. Of course, the outcome of these talks will certainly have implications for Korean farm interests, since Japanese concessions in this area will set a kind of benchmark. And earlier this year in April and subsequently, US and Japanese officials did achieve notable progress in terms of reaching a balance of concessions, and they have attempted to build on this in subsequent talks. And keeping TPP countries informed will be essential in terms of allowing movement toward addressing other important sticking points. Intellectual property, environment, state-owned enterprises comes to mind. So with this progress, there has been sort of a de facto October deadline for US-Japan to announce the details of their market access, and presumably by mid-November, as the leaders have expressed their intentions to announce some sort of handshake or substantive progress toward closing a deal, so that eventually in mid-2015 they could close the deal and iron out the remaining differences. Now, these days, you can't think of conclusion of TPP without Trade Promotion Authority coming to mind as well. So I'll go ahead and pass this off to Jeff to take on that issue.
Well, as anyone involved in trade negotiations know, international trade negotiations are really difficult. And the only thing that perhaps makes them seem easy is domestic trade negotiations, when you have to go home and convince constituencies in your own country that the deal is worthwhile pursuing and ratifying. And therefore, as Kathleen said, we focus on the nexus of issues involving the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Trade Promotion Authority, because that's important both for finishing the deal and for securing the benefits and ratifying it on a timely basis. What we've concluded is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership needs Trade Promotion Authority. But there are several points about Trade Promotion Authority that I think bear notice even to a well-informed audience. And so I'd like to make a few points, both about its implications for the TPP negotiations and for what it means at home. And I'm sure we will then hear more expert opinion from from Angela and Ev from their respective positions in the House and the Senate. I've talked to many TPP ministers and negotiators, and what has become clear in the course of the negotiations is that the lack of trade promotion authority has not blocked the conduct of TPP endgame negotiations. That, I think, is an important point and why you continue to see progress in the international trade negotiations, even though there hasn't been extensive progress in moving TPA legislation on the Hill this year. Nonetheless, Congress may insist on TPA passage prior to concluding TPP. I think there's strong indications in both houses of Congress in that regard. And thus the timing of the legislation is thus closely linked to the TPP. And we'll hear more from Angela and Ev on this, but progress on the legislation has been constrained by the November midterm elections. There is a small chance for action during the lame duck session, but everybody wants to do everything that hasn't been achieved in the congressional session in lame duck, and so there's a very short period of time, and so the chances are rather limited that that will occur. More likely, the new Congress will take up trade promotion authority early on in the spring, late winter, spring of next year. In that regard, with the continuing progress in the TPP negotiations, you can see an iterative process where continuing progress on the negotiating front helps inform the legislative process in Congress. And advances in the trade talks will facilitate the passage of TPP legislation because it's easier for Congress to act if members know the major details of the major deal in which the TPA would be used for. So we see this going forward as long as there continues to be a good dialogue and flow of information between the negotiators and the leaders in Congress. Now, why is trade promotion authority needed? What is obvious to most people in this room is that TPA sets the U.S. negotiating objectives, helps U.S. officials secure domestic support for the implementing legislation. That's well known. What's slightly less well known, but still pretty obvious, is that the passage of the legislation, of implementing legislation, it has been expeditious once the draft is tabled in the House of Representatives. But the process of compiling that legislation, which is really a pre-negotiation or a pseudo-legislative process in and of itself, is often a very lengthy one and very time-consuming, as I will show in the next slide. The negotiation of the implementing legislation usually yields some alterations in the FTA text. So it isn't a guarantee to our trading partners that the deal that they conclude with USTR will be the deal that is finally enters into force once the Congress passes implementing legislation. Almost every U.S. free trade agreement has been changed in one way or another prior to its entry into force. The TPA does not prevent the renegotiation of US FTAs, but it does constrain the scope of such interventions, and that is a very important factor. It is a fact that is well known to US negotiators. It is a fact that is well known to our negotiating partners. So it does give US negotiators a modest boost to have that authority, but it isn't an ironclad guarantee that the deal goes through Congress, because Congress has its own say in what is done. This is a table, a slide that I thought was very important, and it's very clear because Kathleen found a very good way of presenting it. It provides both the time lag between the start of FTA negotiations and the signing of the agreement, and the lag between the signing of the agreement and the implementation for U.S. free trade agreements. In the old days, 2 decades ago, even contentious FTAs like the NAFTA took only a year to implement. Some people may look at the recent experience with the Chorus FTA or the Colombia and Panama, which took 4 or 5 years or more to implement, and say, well, NAFTA was even more contentious, but it only really took a little over a year for NAFTA to pass through the period from signing to entry into force. Obviously, a lot has changed over this period besides trade politics and the complications of the trade agreements. But what this shows is that there can be a considerable lag between the time a deal is negotiated and the time it actually enters into force and the reforms begin to take place. That can be a dead zone, a period when business is still uncertain about the opportunities that will be created for new trade and investment, but it also can be a great period of uncertainty for countries that are considering joining the trade partnership, and that's why it's such an important point to bring out in the context of this paper on Korea and the TPP. Is there time for Korea to join the TPP talks? If you ask that to a U.S. trade negotiator, they will react with some horror and they'll say, "Oh, absolutely not. We can't afford to have complications when we're so close to the finish line." But in reality, if Korea asked to join the TPP very shortly, there would be a process to be considered. USTR would notify Congress as if the old fast-track procedures were still in place, and Congress would have 90 days to consider and consult with USTR about the desirability of a new country joining the talks. So if Korean government is thinking about joining TPP, they have to think out at least 3 months to the future and see what shape the negotiations are in. If you think about the timetable that Kathleen mentioned at the end of her part of the presentation, it's getting very near to the end of the day for Korea to join if they made a decision this week. It's cutting it close. It would be hard for Congress to endorse Korea if there were any residual implementation issues left over or continuing from the implementation of the Chorus FTA. And so there has been ongoing negotiations between the two governments to try to resolve outstanding concerns on both sides about the implementation of that agreement. Progress has been made in many of those issues. I can't say that everyone is yet fully satisfied, but there has been a goodwill effort to move forward on 4 specific concerns that are mentioned in this slide with regard to rules of origin, cross-border data flows, auto emission measures, organic certification procedures, and the like. Now, again, TPP negotiators, I think trying to get to the finish line would say, no, we'd rather not have, we'd rather defer Korean participation so we can finish the job. But if Korea asked to join, could they really say no? And that's the question that I don't think has a good answer. So we turn to what options really face Korea and the TPP partners in looking at what could be done in terms of Korean participation. If you take the initial point that Kathleen made, that our paper starts with, that says sooner or later Korea will need to join the TPP, and so what are the options for joining sooner or joining later? What are the costs and advantages of each approach? Three options as we see it are join the TPP promptly before the talks conclude, but that's a rather narrow window. Join the TPP between signature and entry into force of the pact. This has never been done before. This is an innovative approach, and I'll explain what's involved in that, at least in the recommendations that I've made to TPP countries about this. And the third is to take the more traditional approach and accede to the TPP after the pact's entry into force sometime in the future. So the first option, join quickly. But to join quickly, basically Korea has to act quickly. It has to accept basically what is on the table in the negotiations with regard to the Chorus Plus provisions that will be substantially completed by the end of 2014. And it will have to be able to quickly resolve bilateral market access problems with Japan. And indeed, as Kathleen noted, Korea and Japan tried to negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement back in 2003, and by the end of 2004, the talks were suspended. And there have been attempts to try to revive them, but it hasn't quite happened yet. I doubt that many countries would want to delay the process of concluding the TPP to accommodate Korean entry and have the talks extend for an extensive period of time. That poses a lot of risks, not the least of which would be extending the TPP negotiations well deep into the US presidential election cycle. And so I think there is a strong view among all the TPP countries to try to finish a good deal quickly and not accommodate new members, whether it be Korea or anyone else, by extending the talks for 6 or 12 months while other parts of the negotiations are concluded. So that is a big constraint. But resolving the Korea-Japan differences probably would be the major challenge given the economic and political frictions and the limited time available. I should note that following this course should not complicate, but rather would complement ongoing Korea negotiations with China, with the RCEP countries, and the trilateral negotiations with China and Japan, all of which are on a slower time frame than the TPP, with the possible exception of the China-Korea talks. The second option is to use an accession clause, but to basically encourage TPP negotiators to add something new for prospective growth and membership in the partnership, and that is to establish an open enrollment period between the signature and entry into force for prospective members. I don't believe this has ever been done before, but if you think about the extended period of time between signature and entry into force of the more recent free trade agreements that we saw in the previous slides, you can see that this is something that is worth consideration so that you don't freeze the partnership for several years while the process of ratification goes forward. It's unprecedented, but beneficial given the lag before entry into force. I think if you look at the prospective countries that are thinking about TPP membership and the possible entry in the future of Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, even China is thinking about the costs and benefits of joining TPP in the coming years. Korea is by far and away the only country that could easily apply and meet the criteria very quickly, as we said before. So I suspect that if there was an open enrollment period, Korea might be the only beneficiary of this in in the next year or two, and that would be a consideration for the negotiators and for the legislators to take into account in thinking about their options. Either way, I suspect Korea would be in the U.S. congressional spotlight, and as occurred during the frequent reiterations of the chorus negotiations between 2007 and 2010, Korea might be asked to ante up additional concessions before a vote in the Congress. The chorus precedent, I think, is a telling one. The final option is to accede to TPP after entry into force, and that could be a year, or two, or more down the road. Implicitly, Korea, if they took this option, they'd be giving priority to the Korea-China talks. That's understandable, since China is now Korea's #1 trading partner. Those talks are well on their way to completion, though probably will need a lot more work. It also means deferring talks with Japan and avoiding domestic concerns about bilateral irritants that would emerge in TPP accession talks with regard to agriculture, with regard to investor-state dispute settlement, and other issues that are the focus of various domestic constituencies in Korea. I think proponents of this option discount the gains of the additionality of the TPP that Kathleen talked about at the start of the presentation, and the costs of non-participation in terms of some modest trade and investment diversion. Again, the future accession of the TPP requires a separate congressional vote with the risk of added U.S. demands, just like the second option. And there's a further complication that could arise, because Korea would probably not be the only country at that point seeking accession to the TPP in a second tranche of negotiations involving a number of countries. And in that case, it might be the case that Korea could not control the content or the timing of the joint TPP membership negotiations and would have to participate with a group of countries. So that has led us to conclude that if Korea could meet the rather hard and difficult criteria of moving quickly, it should do so. If the bilateral issues with Japan are manageable, if the politics and economic sensitivities can be dealt with, then move promptly. If not, encourage the second option in terms of open enrollment after the TPP is signed. I think there is little advantage and potential costs to waiting until the TPP enters into force for Korea, both economic and political. I think it doesn't compromise Korea's ability to work with its other neighbors on parallel negotiations in Asia, and particularly with China, where we would encourage Korea to work out the most comprehensive, the most ambitious FTA possible with China, because it would be good for Korea and it would be good for Asia-Pacific economic integration writ large. Thank you very much.
What? Yeah, come on up. I'd like to ask our speakers and our two mystery discussants to come forward. And I now bid farewell to the webcast. The following is off the record. So